Right now we're doing a longitudinal study of infants who are at high risk for autism, and we define that on the basis of the fact that they have an older sibling with an autism diagnosis. And we're particularly interested in the early use of gestures, both in the mothers and in the infants, because gesture is the single most important predictor of future language development. And by gesture here, I mean things like pointing, nodding their head, waving bye-bye. These are the kinds of movements that infants make before they actually begin to speak. And it's a strong predictor of later language. And so in this study, we also observed the relationship between the mother's gestures and the child's later language development. And one of the interesting things that we found there is that both the mothers of the high-risk infants and the low-risk infants gesture a lot to their babies before they start speaking. In fact, if anything, the mothers of the high-risk babies were gesturing a little more than the low-risk infants. However, what we found was that when we looked overall, while for the low-risk infants, the mother's gestures were a good predictor of their later language, this was not true overall for the high-risk infants. Instead, what we found was we had to look more specifically at the gestures that the mother was making only when the infant was directly looking at the mother. When the mother is gesturing and the infant's not directly looking at her, those gestures are not influencing their language development. But we didn't see that same pattern in the low-risk infants. So we think this suggests that there are some subtle attentional differences between the high and the low-risk infants, such that for the low-risk infants, even if they're busy playing with the toy and they're not directly looking at their mother, nevertheless, if the mother starts to point to something out of the corner of their eye, the infant, the low-risk infant, is monitoring that. But the high-risk infant isn't. When he's playing with his toy, he's completely absorbed with his toy. And so the mother's gesturing when he's not looking at her turns out not to have as strong an influence. So I think this suggests something important about differences in early attention and how important that is for their language and potentially other aspects of social development.